Nestled in a quiet corner of the English countryside, the village of Willowcombe had an air of timeless charm. Its cobblestone streets wound gently through clusters of cottages with thatched roofs, their gardens bursting with blooms no matter the season. The surrounding fields stretched wide, framed by rolling hills and thick woodlands, creating a picture of pastoral serenity. Yet, beneath the tranquil surface, Willowcombe harbored peculiar traditions that set it apart from other villages in the county. Chief among these was the reverence for an ancient oak tree that stood at the edge of the village green. Towering and gnarled, the oak seemed as old as time itself, its roots gripping the earth like the claws of some primeval beast. The villagers called it the guardian tree. According to local legend, the tree had been planted by a druid long before the Romans set foot on English soil. It was said to harbor a protective spirit, one that shielded Willowcombe from famine, plague, and other calamities that had, over the centuries, plagued neighboring villages. To disturb the tree, it was whispered, would be to invite its wrath, a curse that could unravel the very fabric of village life. Every spring, the villagers gathered around the guardian tree for a festival. Wreaths of flowers were hung on its branches, songs were sung in its honor, and the village elder would recount the story of its origin. Children sat wide-eyed as the tale unfolded of how the tree had once saved the village during a time of great drought, miraculously summoning a storm to replenish the parched earth. But the reverence went beyond festivals. When a couple married, they tied a ribbon around one of the lower branches to seek the tree's blessing. Farmers, before planting their crops, would scatter a handful of soil from the tree's base into their fields. Even during disputes, the villagers would often convene beneath the oak, trusting its silent presence to guide them to a fair resolution. For centuries, the tree stood unchallenged, its presence woven into the fabric of daily life. Even the most skeptical among the villagers, those who scoffed at tales of protective spirits, would think twice before acting against it. The guardian tree, after all, was more than just a symbol. It was an unspoken bond, connecting the people of Willowcombe to their ancestors and to each other. That is, until the arrival of George Pendleton. George was new to the village, having purchased a dilapidated cottage on the outskirts with grand plans of restoring it to its former glory. He was a man of reason and progress, unimpressed by what he called rural nonsense. To George, the guardian tree was no more than an eyesore, its sprawling branches casting a perpetual shadow over his garden. He dismissed the villagers' warnings as silly superstitions, determined to assert his modern sensibilities over their outdated ways. Little did he know that his decision to act against the tree would set into motion a chain of events that would change Willowcombe forever. George Pendleton arrived in Willowcombe with all the confidence of a man who believed he could tame the world. A Londoner by birth, he had grown tired of the noise, the pollution, and the relentless pace of city life. The picturesque advertisement for a quaint country cottage in Willowcombe had promised a peaceful retreat, a place where he could retire early and enjoy a simpler existence. What the advertisement had failed to mention, of course, was the peculiarities of the village and its inhabitants. At first, George was content with his new surroundings. His cottage, though in need of repair, had charm, and the sweeping views of the countryside were everything he had hoped for, except for one glaring obstruction. From his kitchen window, instead of the uninterrupted fields and hills he had imagined, he was confronted with the enormous bulk of the guardian tree. Its twisted branches stretched skyward, blotting out the sunlight and dominating the landscape like a silent sentinel. George found it insufferable. "It's just a tree," he muttered to himself on more than one occasion as he glared at it over his morning tea. Why should a perfectly good view be ruined by something so grotesque? When he voiced his irritation to the villagers, their reactions ranged from mild shock to outright horror. "You mustn't speak of the guardian tree like that," warned Mrs. Edith Lockwood, the elderly owner of the village shop. "It's protected this village for generations. Bad things happen to those who don't respect it." "Nonsense," George scoffed. "It's just an overgrown plant. A bit of lumber is hardly going to bring down a curse." The more he complained, the more adamant the villagers became. They told him stories of storms that had mysteriously missed Willowcombe, of plagues that had devastated neighboring villages but left theirs untouched. Each tale only deepened George's resolve to rid himself of the superstitious nonsense that seemed to cloud the otherwise logical minds of his neighbors. Finally, after weeks of brooding and failed attempts to convince the village council to approve the tree's removal, George decided to take matters into his own hands. One crisp autumn morning, while most of the villagers were attending the weekly market in a nearby town, George hired a local woodcutter. Together, they brought axes, saws, and a rope to bring down the great oak. As the first blow of the axe struck the tree's bark, a strange hush fell over the clearing. The birds, which had been chirping noisily moments before, went silent. The air seemed to grow thick and heavy, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. The woodcutter hesitated. "I don't know, Mr. Pendleton. Feels wrong, somehow." "Nonsense," George barked. "It's just wood. Keep chopping." Reluctantly, the woodcutter resumed his work, and soon the mighty oak began to groan and creak. It was an unsettling sound, like the anguished cry of something alive. With a final crack, the tree toppled, its massive trunk crashing to the ground in a thunderous roar that seemed to echo far beyond the village green. George stood triumphantly over the fallen giant, wiping sweat from his brow. "There," he said, "problem solved." But as the tree lay shattered, the villagers began to return from the market. They gathered around the clearing, their faces pale with shock and disbelief. Mrs. Lockwood was among them, clutching her chest as though she could barely breathe. "You fool," she whispered. "What have you done?" "It's just a tree," George said, growing irritated. "You'll thank me when the sunlight finally reaches this patch of land." But the villagers were not listening. One by one, they backed away from the clearing, murmuring prayers under their breath. A young boy burst into tears, clinging to his mother's skirts as she hurried him away. That evening, as George sat by his fire with a glass of wine, he couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over him. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the shadows cast by the firelight seemed to dance in unsettling patterns. For the first time since he arrived in Willowcombe, George felt a flicker of doubt, but he brushed it aside. "Superstitious fools," he muttered, refilling his glass. "The lot of them." As the night deepened, the unease grew, and the first whispers of the curse began to stir in the village. The night after the guardian tree was felled, an unnatural stillness hung over Willowcombe. The usual symphony of crickets and rustling leaves was absent, replaced by a suffocating silence that seemed to press down on the village. Those who dared venture outdoors after dusk spoke of an eerie sensation, as though unseen eyes were watching from the shadows. By morning, the first signs of trouble began to emerge. Old Tom, the village's most experienced farmer, was the first to sound the alarm. His fields, which had been lush with ripening crops the day before, were now desolate. Corn stalks stood shriveled and blackened, as if scorched by an invisible fire. When he tried to break open a withered ear of corn, it crumbled into ash in his hands. "What's happened here?" Tom muttered, fear creeping into his voice. "This isn't natural." Down at the pasture, the shepherd Samuel found his sheep huddled together, bleating in distress. Several of them had collapsed overnight, their breathing shallow and labored. A few had died, their eyes wide with terror. The village vet, summoned in haste, could find no explanation. "They're not sick, not in the usual sense," he said grimly. "It's as though they've been frightened to death." The villagers gathered in the green, their faces pale with fear. Whispers spread quickly. The guardian tree's spirit had been angered. The curse had begun. But the strangest incidents occurred at night. Many villagers reported hearing low, mournful wails that seemed to drift on the wind. Others claimed to have seen ghostly figures flitting between the trees at the edge of the woods, their shapes indistinct but undeniably human. Doors rattled on their hinges, though the air was still. Dogs refused to leave their kennels, cowering and whimpering, as though sensing something their human companions could not. In her small, dimly lit shop, Mrs. Edith Lockwood sat behind the counter, her hands trembling as she counted coins. Edith was one of the oldest and most respected residents of Willowcombe. She had lived through 2 wars and had seen the village survive floods, blights, and other misfortunes. But even she was shaken by the events of the past few days. "This is no coincidence," she said one afternoon, as a group of villagers crowded into the shop seeking answers. "We've brought this upon ourselves. Or rather, he has." She gestured toward the window where George Pendleton's cottage stood in the distance. The villagers turned to look, their expressions a mix of anger and fear. "What do you mean, Mrs. Lockwood?" asked Samuel, clutching his hat nervously. Edith sighed and beckoned them closer. "The old legend," she began, her voice heavy with foreboding. "It's been passed down for generations. The guardian tree wasn't just a symbol, it was a protector. The story goes that a druid bound a spirit to that tree, a spirit that would shield us from harm so long as the tree stood undisturbed. But the spirit also carried a warning. Any who harmed the tree would bring ruin upon the village." "But surely that's just a tale," Samuel said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Edith countered, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "Have you ever wondered why Willowcombe has been spared so many disasters while neighboring villages have not? The plague never reached us. The floods that devastated Broadstone left us untouched. And now, look around. The moment that tree fell, everything began to unravel." The villagers murmured in agreement. Even the most skeptical among them couldn't deny the timing of the events. They glanced at each other, their fear hardening into anger. "What do we do now, Mrs. Lockwood?" asked young Margaret, her voice barely above a whisper. Edith leaned back in her chair, her expression grave. "I don't know if there's a way to stop it. The tree is gone, and the spirit's wrath has been unleashed. But one thing is certain. George Pendleton is the one who brought this curse upon us, and it seems we're all paying the price." As the villagers filed out of the shop, their faces dark with worry, Edith sat in silence, her gaze fixed on the spot where the guardian tree had once stood. The stump was still there, a stark reminder of what had been lost. In her heart, she feared that the worst was yet to come. The sun rose over Willowcombe one chilly morning, its rays cutting through the lingering mist that clung to the village. As the villagers went about their uneasy routines, a blood-curdling scream shattered the fragile calm. It came from George Pendleton's cottage. Mrs. Agnes Turner, George's housekeeper, had arrived early to clean his home, only to find him lying in the garden near the stump of the guardian tree. His body was splayed out on the damp grass, his face frozen in an expression of abject terror. His wide, glassy eyes seemed to stare into some unseen abyss, and his mouth hung open, as if caught in a silent scream. There were no signs of a struggle, no injuries or marks on his body, just an overwhelming aura of fear that seemed to emanate from the lifeless form. Within the hour, the village was abuzz with whispers and speculation. "The curse got him," murmured old Tom, crossing himself as he spoke. "The tree's spirit took its revenge." Others nodded solemnly, their suspicions aligning with the growing dread that had gripped Willowcombe. Inspector Harold Green arrived by mid-morning, summoned from the nearby town of Casterbridge. A tall, lanky man in his 50s, Green was known for his meticulous nature and unshakable skepticism. He had solved countless cases, from petty thefts to murders, but the talk of curses and vengeful spirits amused him more than it alarmed him. As he stood over George's body, his sharp blue eyes took in every detail: the undisturbed grass around the corpse, the absence of blood, and the peculiar look on George's face. He crouched down, running his gloved hand over the stump of the felled oak nearby. "Strange, indeed," he muttered, rising to his feet. "But I've yet to meet a curse that leaves no fingerprints." Inspector Green set up a temporary office in the village pub, the Green Dragon, and began the arduous task of interviewing the villagers. One by one, they came, bringing with them tales of the guardian tree, whispered warnings, and long-buried grudges against George Pendleton. As the unofficial historian of Willowcombe, Edith was the first person Green summoned. She recounted the legend of the guardian tree in meticulous detail, her tone laced with both sorrow and vindication. "I warned him," she said, shaking her head. "We all did. He dismissed us as fools. And now look what's happened." Green pressed her further. "You've lived here all your life, Mrs. Lockwood. Did Mr. Pendleton have any enemies?" Edith hesitated. "He didn't make friends easily, Inspector. He was brash, dismissive of our ways. But enemies? That's a strong word." The farmer was visibly uneasy, wringing his cap in his hands as he sat before Green. "I'm not saying I believe in ghosts, Inspector, but there's something unnatural about all this. That man disrespected the tree, and now he's gone. That's all I'll say." Green raised an eyebrow. "Did you see or hear anything unusual the night before Mr. Pendleton's death?" Tom shook his head. "Not a thing. Just the wind. But it sounded different, like it was crying." The young schoolteacher seemed nervous as she spoke. "Mr. Pendleton was rude to many of us. He didn't understand our traditions and didn't care to. But I didn't think anyone would want to harm him." "Anyone in particular have a reason to?" Green asked. Margaret hesitated. "Well, there were rumors. Some said he was planning to sell part of his land to developers. If that had happened, It could have ruined the farmland nearby. Samuel provided a more personal grudge. Pendleton threatened my sheep, he admitted. Said they were grazing too close to his garden. But I wouldn't hurt the man, Inspector. I've no love for him. But murder? That's not in me. As the interviews progressed, Green uncovered a tapestry of resentment and mistrust. George Pendleton, it seemed, had clashed with nearly everyone in the village. From his plans to alter the land, to his dismissive attitude toward their customs, he had made himself a lightning rod for animosity. But something didn't sit right with Green. While the villagers' grievances were evident, none seemed capable of the cold precision required to commit murder, and the lack of physical evidence only deepened the mystery. That evening, as Green pored over his notes, he returned to the one consistent element in every account: the guardian tree. Though he dismissed the notion of curses, he couldn't ignore the symbolic weight the tree carried for the villagers. Was it possible that someone had used the legend as a cover for a more earthly motive? Green resolved to revisit the scene of the crime the next morning, determined to find the piece of evidence that would unravel the truth behind George Pendleton's death. Little did he know that the case would take yet another chilling turn before the night was through. The following morning, Inspector Harold Green stood once more in George Pendleton's garden, surveying the scene under the crisp autumn light. Though the villagers whispered of curses and vengeful spirits, Green's instincts told him there was something far more tangible and far more human at work here. Armed with his notebook and a determined mind, he began piecing together George's life in Willowcombe. It didn't take long for a pattern to emerge. George had been a man of many disputes. Green revisited Samuel, the shepherd, and pressed him further about his interactions with George. He was always going on about my sheep, Samuel admitted, his face flushed with frustration. He claimed they were trampling his garden, but that wasn't the real issue. What was? Green asked. Samuel hesitated. He wanted to fence off part of the green for himself. Said he had plans. Never told us what they were, but I reckon he didn't care much about the rest of us. Green made a note. George's plans were beginning to sound significant. Old Tom, the farmer whose crops had mysteriously withered after the tree's destruction, had his own grievances. Pendleton was poking around my land a few weeks ago, Tom revealed, leaning on his walking stick. He said he was surveying for property lines. Didn't like the sound of that one bit. Did he mention why? Green asked. Not directly, but I overheard him talking to a man in a suit not long after. A surveyor, maybe? Something about potential buyers. Green's ears perked up. Potential buyers? This wasn't just about land disputes. It was starting to sound like a business transaction. Green returned to the pub and asked around. Several villagers recalled seeing George meeting with strangers from out of town. A few described men in sleek cars driving through the narrow village lanes. Developers, muttered Margaret Harper, the schoolteacher, with an air of disdain. They've been trying to buy up farmland around here for years, but no one's sold. If Pendleton was planning to sell, he'd have been the first to betray the village. As Green pieced together the testimonies, he decided to search George's cottage for more concrete evidence. The local constable, a young man eager to assist, handed Green a small brass key that had been found in George's pocket. It unlocked a desk drawer in the study, where Green discovered a thick envelope bearing the logo of a real estate firm. Inside was a draft contract, between George and a development company, outlining plans to sell a sizable portion of his land. The terms were generous, enough to make anyone consider betraying their neighbors. The land in question bordered both Old Tom's Fields and the village green, meaning the construction would have disrupted farming, grazing, and the local ecosystem. Alongside the contract was a letter from the firm, thanking George for his initiative and promising swift action once the sale was finalized. The date of the final meeting? The day after George's death. Green sat back in his chair, the pieces falling into place. George had been planning this for weeks, maybe months, and had kept it a secret from the villagers. The fallout from such a betrayal would have been catastrophic. It was no wonder so many in the village had reasons to despise him. However, Green wasn't satisfied. The discovery explained why George was hated, but not how he had died. The absence of physical injuries, the peculiar expression on his face, and the villagers' insistence on a supernatural explanation all pointed to something more. He revisited the idea of the curse, not as a supernatural force, but as a weapon. Could someone have used the villagers' belief in the curse to frighten George to death? It seemed far-fetched, but Green couldn't dismiss the possibility entirely. One name stood out in his mind: Mrs. Edith Lockwood. She had been the most vocal about the tree's legend and the curse. She had both the knowledge and the influence to manipulate the villagers, and as the unofficial keeper of Willowcomb's traditions, she would have had the most to lose from George's plans. Determined to uncover the truth, Green set out to confront Edith, knowing that her story could hold the final clue to unraveling the mystery. The question remained, had she been a protector of tradition or a mastermind of murder? The Green Dragon pub was unusually crowded that evening. Word had spread that Inspector Harold Green had called for a gathering, claiming he had uncovered the truth behind George Pendleton's mysterious death. The air inside was thick with anticipation and unease. Villagers huddled together, whispering nervously, their gazes darting toward the corner where Mrs. Edith Lockwood sat, her face calm, but her eyes sharp as ever. Inspector Green entered, his tall figure commanding attention as he made his way to the front of the room. He carried a leather-bound notebook and a small satchel, which he placed on the counter with deliberate care. Clearing his throat, he addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "I have spent the last few days investigating the death of Mr. George Pendleton. While many of you have spoken of curses and vengeful spirits, I must inform you that the truth is far more human." The room fell silent, save for the creak of a chair as someone shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Lockwood's lips tightened, but she said nothing. "George Pendleton was not a man well liked in this village," Green continued, his eyes scanning the room. "His disregard for your traditions and his plans to sell land to developers created a great deal of tension. But these tensions alone did not kill him." He opened his notebook and read aloud. Several villagers reported seeing George in secret meetings with outsiders. Developers who would have built on land vital to your farms, your livelihoods, and your way of life. The evidence I found in his home confirmed these suspicions. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Green raised a hand to silence them. "But what I also found," he said, reaching into his satchel, "was this." He pulled out a small vial, its contents a pale yellow powder. "This is aconite, also known as wolf's bane, a highly toxic plant. Its effects are subtle but devastating. In small doses, it causes extreme fear, hallucinations, and eventually heart failure. A collective gasp swept the room. Green locked eyes with Mrs. Lockwood, who remained motionless, her hands folded neatly in her lap. George Pendleton was poisoned, Green declared, his voice cutting through the tension. The symptoms mimic what one might expect from a supernatural attack. Hallucinations of ghostly figures, a sense of impending doom, and ultimately, death. It was a clever ruse designed to make his demise appear as though the curse of the guardian tree had taken him. He turned to the crowd. But this was no act of nature. This was a calculated plan, carried out by those who sought to protect this village and its traditions at any cost. Green paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. Then he pointed directly at Mrs. Lockwood. "And it was led by you, Mrs. Lockwood." A stunned silence followed, broken only by the scrape of a chair, as Mrs. Lockwood slowly rose to her feet. Her face betrayed no guilt, only a weary defiance. "You're a clever man, Inspector," she said quietly, her voice steady. "But you don't understand what it means to protect something sacred." Green folded his arms. "Explain it to me, then." Mrs. Lockwood sighed. "George Pendleton was going to destroy everything we hold dear. The guardian tree was not just a symbol. It was the heart of this village. When he cut it down, he unleashed chaos, not from a curse, but from his own arrogance." Her gaze swept over the villagers. "We couldn't let him go through with his plans. The land, the traditions, they mean everything to us. Without them, Willowcombe would become just another soulless town." "Who helped you?" Green asked, his tone firm. Mrs. Lockwood hesitated, then said, "It doesn't matter. This was my decision. If you need someone to blame, blame me." The room erupted into a cacophony of voices. Some villagers defended Mrs. Lockwood, praising her for her courage and dedication to the village. Others recoiled in horror at the lengths she had gone to, insisting that murder could never be justified. Green raised his voice above the clamor. "Silence. What was done here was wrong. While I understand the sentiment behind your actions, you cannot take the law into your own hands." Turning to the constable, he instructed, "Arrest Mrs. Lockwood." As the constable approached, Mrs. Lockwood held her head high. "I have no regrets," she said firmly. "Willowcombe will endure, even without me." Mrs. Lockwood and two of her accomplices, who later confessed to helping her procure and administer the poison, were taken into custody. The village remained divided. Some viewed them as protectors of tradition, while others condemned them as criminals. As Inspector Green prepared to leave Willowcombe, he took one last walk through the village. The stump of the guardian tree remained, a stark reminder of both the community's unity and its fractures. For all its charm, the village had shown him the lengths people would go to preserve what they loved, even if it meant crossing moral lines. And as Green boarded the train back to Casterbridge, he couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. In Willowcombe, the lines between right and wrong, justice and vengeance, had become irrevocably blurred.